Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Accelerating Through the Turn, How Organizations Can Transform to Perform. And now I'd like to turn you over to your host, Laura Manson.
Thank you, everyone, Donna, and welcome everyone to Accelerating Through the Turn. This is the first in our second series of webinars on dealing with the consequences of COVID-19. My name's Laura Manson-Smith, and I'm going to be your host for the next 3 webinars. Now, the subject of today's webinar is how your organization can transform to perform. We're still clearly right in the middle of a really terrible global crisis, but we know that many of you are already thinking about recovery and how your organization, your leaders, and your workforce will need to change as we emerge. Now, while the crisis has been the most challenging that many of us have faced professionally, we have also seen things like agility, decisiveness, collaboration, a real customer centricity, innovation, and empathy thrive. Today, we're going to discuss how can you take the best of what you've become and preserve this in your future ways of working. But let's pause for 1 second for a reality check. I'm sure that many of you listening today are in the middle of making really tough decisions right now to protect your business and your people. And you may be looking at things like restructuring. If you're in that really difficult situation today, we believe you also have a unique opportunity, and that is to do this in a way that doesn't just reduce cost, but also looks at how you can align your organization and your culture to help your business thrive after this crisis. I'm joined here today by colleagues from around the globe, and they have lots of experience in organization design, leadership, and culture transformation in a range of different industries. And you can see their names and their faces up on the screen right now. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Gary Burnison, our CEO at Korn Ferry, who will set the scene for us.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. If I ask you who is America's most winning football coach of all time, a lot of people would probably say, Vince Lombardi or Nick Saban, Bill Belichick. But actually, the most winning coach in American football history is probably somebody you don't know. His name is the late John McKessick. John passed away last year. He was 93 years old. John, during his career, had an unbelievable 621 wins, spanning over 60 seasons. He coached a high school football team in a small town, Summerville, South Carolina. And years ago, I learned one of my most valuable leadership lessons from him. We visited him, had the honor of spending time with him. And at the time, he had 576 wins, a lot of wins. And earlier, the town had given him, he wore this big ring. It was this green background. It had a lot of diamonds. And in the middle, it had the number 500, 500. And the town had given it to him to celebrate at that point, his 500th win. And at the time that we saw him, like I said, he had 575 wins. And walking through town, somebody came up to him, very excited, said, Coach, we're working on a new ring for you. And we're working on number 600. And, John turned to him and with a grin said, I don't want it with 600. I want it with 577. One win at a time. And that's kind of what we're in today, is one day at a time. And the question, I think, for all of us is, as leaders, you can only improve an organization if you improve yourself. The distance between number 1 and number 2, it's not constant. It's constantly changing. So the question that we have for us is what we do with this moment. And when we're younger, we're always looking to the next moment and the next moment. And when we finally get there, we realize, okay, what was really important was the journey. And so the question for us today is to improve any organization you first have to improve yourself. And so that's what I would challenge all of us with in order to improve the organization. How are we improving ourselves? And not asking the question, what will we be, but rather, who do we want to be? So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura. Have a great webinar, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Gary, and you've just set the scene perfectly and captured the spirit that we wanted to evoke in this webinar. Now, the topics that we're going to cover in this webinar series are really interconnected. And Darcy, if you could move the slide forward, please. And what you see here on the diagram is that we're focusing today on organization priorities, and we've kind of shone a light down through the middle of this framework for action. But the framework covers principles that are addressed in all the topics we address. So first of all, Michelle, could I ask you to comment first on the point here that's going to pop up, I hope, in a second on the right-hand side. Purpose is the new strategy. What do we mean by purpose is the new strategy?
Absolutely. Purpose is incredibly important, as we all know. What is purpose? It's your reason for being, whether it's you as an individual, you as an organization, you as a team. It's the purpose that drives you. And during this crisis, we really have seen the power of purpose in uniting people together, as I said, both personally, but also workforces. So organizations who already have very strong, enduring purposes have really rallied behind those and used those as a means to achieve outcomes during this time. A good example of that is John Deere, a company many of us are familiar with. They work in the agriculture products and services space. Now, agriculture is something that has needed to continue during this time. And John Deere has really doubled down on its purpose and its role in the farming ecosystem. And what kind of behaviors has this driven? Well, they've provided small business loans to farmers. They've also very quickly made sure that warehouses can stay open and stay operational. So their clear purpose around the role that they play to the farming community really helped them all unite together and deliver even in a really challenging time.
Yeah, and you know, I think what's also interesting, Michelle, is that we've seen organizations that didn't have a defined purpose prior to the crisis, and they've almost created one, which is how do we get through and how do we survive together? And that's really, you know, that's really working for them now. But I think once that goes away, there could be a huge void.
Absolutely, that's right. And that's one of the first things that we really urge everyone to do. If you don't have a clear, compelling purpose for your organization, the first step needs to be defining what that is, taking a step back and making sure that you have a meaningful, customer-centric purpose, and then you can align your leadership and your workforce around that.
Thank you. And the second point called out here is that priorities replace long-term plans. But surely, Michelle, we're not really suggesting that companies shouldn't do long-term planning anymore, are we?
No, of course not. Strategy is as important, if not more important than ever. What's different is the time frames that you're using to deliver against that strategy. So even before COVID-19, our research was showing that organizations were moving away from the multi-year heavy planning process to one that's a bit more nimble and agile. Increasingly, what we see is that businesses have to operate at two speeds. One is the quarter to quarter driving near-term results, and the other is having that long-term vision, that long-term purpose, that long-term strategy that you're aligning everything towards. So our recommendation here is not just to have the longer-term strategy, but importantly, during this critical time, to have your near-term business priorities that are defined and that you can share widely throughout your organization.
Okay, makes sense. And what do we mean by organizational capabilities, and why are these so important right now?
Yeah, organizational capabilities are, they're simply the things that your organization needs to be good at in order to achieve the results that you want to achieve. It's a combination of processes, systems and tools, skills, knowledge and behaviors, and organizational structures. And all those things combined allow you to deliver against your goals. So in our work, we find that clarity of what really creates value in your business is imperative to defining the right organizational capabilities. So for example, there's a global consumer brand that we've worked with who realized through this crisis that supply chain is a key organizational capability. It's key to their success, but they haven't invested in it that way. It's always played second fiddle to marketing. But they think that for the long term, that it's a sustainable competitive advantage for them, and it will help maximize speed and customer value. So the change that this is driving for them now is that they have a laser sharp focus on developing and enabling a totally new breed of supply chain talent that's going to help them accelerate into the future. So our recommendation here for you is really to reassess and redefine your organizational capabilities. Now, we're not talking about 5 or 10 or 12, literally 2 to 3 organizational capabilities. Narrow in on those crucial capabilities that are really the things that will drive your outcome and accelerate your rebound.
I think that concept of focus is so important right now because we're doing everything at speed, and it's important to focus to do a few things really well rather than have that long list. So to help you make a decision and focus in on those business priorities, we'd recommend getting really clear on your organization's financial, leadership, and organizational health. And we've updated our Korn Ferry Organization Scan Diagnostic for the attributes that we think will help organizations get through this crisis stronger. And it plots your organization on the chart that you see here according to your current status. So you may be in survival mode, and this is really characterized by going through major restructuring right now and divestments. If you're in preservation, this is about cost optimization and cash generation. If you're exploring, this means you're really looking at reshaping your portfolio to do 2 things, to drive efficiency, but also performance. And the top right-hand box is disruption. And this is where you're really reshaping your portfolio because you want to go into new markets and you want to access new business opportunities. Now, at the end of the session, we're going to provide access to everyone on this call to a free version of this diagnostic. Usually it's a fuller one that you would send out to the full organization, but this will give you a personal snapshot of where your organization is today. And when you complete the questions, you'll get an instant report back. But let's focus just for a minute on the box here on the bottom left on survival. Because I'm sure that there are a number of organizations represented here today who are really here right now and focusing on, shoring up their business financially. Paul, I'm going to turn to you and ask you, people costs are such a significant part of any organization's cost base. How can you do that thing of balancing your cost savings with thinking about future growth?
That's a great question, Laura. And I see a lot of leaders wrestling with this one right now. In fact, we're actively working with a large retail bank just at this moment. And in a second, I'll talk a little bit about how they're tackling the question that you've asked. But I think, first of all, looking at the question itself, there's a tension between this cost saving now and the future growth. And to resolve this tension, we need to answer 2 questions well. First of all, the kind of lights on question, can we stay in business? What the bank called liquidity. And we'll have, businesses are having to make hard choices right now, aren't they? They're kind of pay freezes, shifting people to virtual working and the like. But alongside this and in tension with this, we have to kind of ask that question, can we sustain and grow our business in the future? The retail bank, in this case, termed that the solvency question. And it's really about sustainable post-pandemic growth. And so you have to be really careful here. We're making hard choices, but we mustn't lose the people who are the growth engine in the future. So let's look at the bank. Let's look at the retail bank. So we worked with them, and what you see on the slide here is their pre- and post-pandemic choices. So we work with them to scenario plan different short-term and long-term options. And it's led to some interesting conclusions. First of all, there's been some earlier than planned branch closures, and you see that reflected at the top of the slide here. In pre-pandemic, the branch-based roles going down more slowly, and that's been speeded up with branch closures. But equally, they also needed to decided to accelerate a lot of the digitization and also cross-skilling of those previous branch banking staff into roles that they called universal bankers. So what is a universal banker? A universal banker is those employees who are available for you or I to phone up for an online consultation around a whole array of kind of customer service requests. That might be a quick transaction, you just need to sort out a bill or something, but it might include some broader financial advice, particularly, you know, as we move out of this crisis time. And you can really see that how the growth of these universal banking roles, which you see reflected at the bottom of the slide, the fast growth of these is instrumental to that change. Now, if they hadn't used the right analytics, they would have laid off a load of these staff during the branch closure program. But now they've been retrained into a lot of these universal banking roles. And these people really are at the heart of customer satisfaction and ultimately sustainable revenue for the bank. So it's a critical capability that they've built, as Michelle put it.
I see. So Paul, if I'm in the position right now of having to make the tough choices that you've outlined, what practical recommendations would you give me?
Okay, Laura, we'd recommend 4 practical actions, which are highlighted on the slide here. So if we look first on the left there, first of all, you need a good, but not a perfect baseline of people data. This is enough data to know the answers to some key questions. So what's the balance and makeup of my staff base, particularly some of those critical roles in the bank there, for instance? Where do those people work? Do they work on site? Do they work virtually? How do they work? And then can some of these roles be delivered virtually? Could they be digitized or reskilled in some way? So get that good baseline in place. It's a foundation. And I urge those people listening today, just have a think about where are your key staff today? What's the opportunity inherent in that? Second, we turn to the subject that Michelle touched on a lot there, which is about understanding critical organizational capabilities. This is the critical capabilities that you need to be successful now and post-pandemic. In the banking example, it was the universal bankers and that digital banking capability. And then third, just get a real laser focus on the work and workforce choices open to you. Now that varies between markets. In the UK, we've got some different opportunities from the US and from other parts of Europe. But they might, for instance, for the workforce include pay freezes, deferred reward, furloughing of staff, and the use of contingent workers. But there's also work options there about automating work, or even we've seen quite a few people launch new or different products, particularly for this time. And we've seen some great examples of creativity, and I urge people to put their creative thinking caps on here. We had a lovely example in the UK where there was a big fashion chain, and they've chosen to lend their staff during this period to a food retailing chain. So make creative use of your staff there. And then that's in the fourth recommendation, it comes together in the use of those workforce analytics to bring together people and financial data, because this is a human and financial decision to be made into a set of future scenarios so that you as a leadership team can make the right choices. So hopefully, Laura, in those 4 practical actions there, there's some practical pointers to our listeners today.
Thank you, Paul. I was reflecting on a conversation I had with a CEO who was telling us She has to make these critical business decisions every 24 hours. And each time she doesn't have all the information she would ideally like to have. And, I think as you've explained here, the data you gather in this exercise may not be perfect, but if you can get started on your critical roles, it's going to let you model out different options as we get more information, as we learn how the virus is subsiding and how interventions in different countries are having an impact. So moving on to talk about positive behaviors. And, if you're anything like me, you start the day right now and doing something you absolutely shouldn't. And that is picking up your phone and looking at the news. And, there's so many difficult stories to digest. And it certainly doesn't set you up in the positive frame of mind that might be helpful right now. But what I really love is as you go through the day, I find at least I'm hearing wonderful stories about really great things that people are doing to move their organizations forward. And we wanted to take this opportunity now to get a bit of a collective pulse from our listeners here today and to hear from you, which of the following behaviors have you seen emerge more during this crisis? So we've got agility, decisiveness, collaboration, a real focus on customers, innovation and empathy. And so we're going to launch a poll just now. And could you select from that poll everything that you've seen more of during the crisis? And while you're voting, I'm going to ask Coy to share some examples, Coy, of things that you've seen during the pandemic.
Thanks, Laura. And like you, I think we've all been impressed with some of the breakthroughs we've been seeing from many organizations, starting with agility. In the UK, the National Health Service, which actually is the 5th largest employer in the world, has taken 2 weeks to transform to virtual doctor consultations, a change that by their own admission would normally have taken many years. And in fighting COVID-19, we've seen several companies, notably in the pharma and life sciences space, partnering with the competition, sharing research and data, and working much more collaboratively, both within and outside their organizations. And last set of examples that have really made me smile, I suppose, are those focused around customer centricity and in particular in retailing. Lots of accelerations of moves online and putting in place new processes, ensuring delivery from store to curbside in record time. The CMO that was leading this noted that it was the increased focus on helping customers during this crisis that led to the breakthrough of people working together across silos to make this happen.
Oh, some great examples. So let's see what results came through. And that is really interesting. And so the top score here we're seeing is collaboration, with 72% of you saying that you saw them. I think probably influenced somewhat by the last example, Coy. But I think what also jumps out for me is that empathy is showing up. And I was talking to an HR director recently who said that she felt that COVID-19 had given a new lease of life to some of her policies around flexible working. And virtual working had proved that it could be effective. And what she'd seen is that leaders and managers in her organization had suddenly been exposed to the home life of working parents. And it had created this great sense of empathy. So thank you. Very, very interesting to see those themes. But all of these behaviors scored pretty highly in the polling. And, I think now I'll come to Michelle. If you're trying to restructure your organization with those behaviors in mind, and particularly the behavior of agility, what can you do? How can you embed those behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the key questions, and it's one that almost everyone is asking right now. Unfortunately, most organizations are not designed to support the types of behaviors that we were just talking about: agility, collaboration, empathy. In this crisis, people have broken down organizational boundaries because they had to. All of the examples that Coy gave, those are things that people had to do in order to meet customer demands and in order to survive. If you want those behaviors to continue, however, you will need to make changes to your organizational structure, because if the structure remains fundamentally the same, then unfortunately, people's behaviors will revert back very quickly. So In order to enable those desired behaviors, we really need to move away from the traditional hierarchical organization where leaders delegate tasks and they protect all their people from any type of ambiguity, to a much more fluid ecosystem where people collaborate quickly and effectively and efficiently, where leaders provide direction, but it's with the goal of empowering people and empowering people to do their job effectively. And really importantly, one where all employees are exposed to ambiguity. So one of the reasons that's so important is because one of the biggest characteristics of this crisis is the unknown nature of it. Not just the unknown nature of the virus itself, but the unknown nature of what's going to happen, how we'll reopen, what things will look like in the future, what is the new normal. All of these are unknown. And for those of us who work with different types of stakeholders, there's an unknown about stakeholders' expectations and behaviors. So whether your stakeholders are consumers or customers or patients, it's not clear what they're going to expect from us in the future. So that's why an agile organization is so important, is because an agile organization is one that can quickly change to address emerging demands or changing expectations from their stakeholders. It's one in which quick decision-making and execution is important. It's one where collaboration and an agile approach is used daily. And it's one that will prepare all of your employees to respond to the challenges that lie ahead of us. So there are 5 things to really think about as you build an agile organization. The first one is to reduce the levels of hierarchy. Now think about your current organization, how many levels you probably have in it. It may surprise you to know that best-in-class benchmark for highly agile organizations is only 3 to 4 levels. The second point is to group different functions with similar and highly interdependent capabilities together. The third suggestion is to create bigger, more versatile teams that are formed around end-to-end accountability. We often call these SMART teams that are comprised of diverse individuals that are led by an inclusive leader and that are created around the context of what needs to be done. They're not static, but they're created each time there's a new problem to be solved or something that we need to deliver on. Individuals and individual units are not going to be able to solve the challenges of today. That's why these interdependent teams are really important, and breaking down silos that will allow for greater accountability across the entire cycle of the business challenge or the problem. The fourth one is to redefine how you're engaging with the ecosystem around you. We're already seeing this from a number of different places where people are partnering with those that used to be their arch enemies, their stiffest competitors. And the partnerships that need to be formed in the ecosystem of the future look different than your traditional supply chain or your traditional procurement partnerships. So we really encourage you, as my colleague was saying, to put on your creative hats around what partnerships look like in the future. And the last one is to introduce cross-functional communities of expertise in your organization. There's no time right now for knowledge to be kept in different pockets, for lessons learned to be kept in different pockets of your organization. Now is the time to share quickly and to share often, and centers of expertise are really the best way of doing that.
Thanks, Michelle. That's a really helpful list. Ignacio, tell us what you found.
Yes, sure, Laura. Here you can see a real example of an HR transformation from a hierarchical organization to an agile one. So this story is going to illustrate why you can do it. So before the transformation in the HR organization, they had several agendas. That means each unit set its own priorities. They work with very small projects with a long time for delivery. People were doing a mix between project and working on recurrent tasks. And unit work in silos, so they missed the opportunity to get feedback from other units. And what happened after the transformation? Now they have a single agenda that allows people to be focused on those tasks and projects that are a high priority. They have fewer projects with better delivery times. There is a separation between recurrent tasks and projects. And the employees are more versatile, improving the quality of the project and the tasks with more multidisciplinary team. So at the end, and within the new HR function, they have improved 4 KPIs. 1, time to market, quick decision making, and more autonomy. 2, employee engagement was increased, more empowerment to individuals, and more development opportunity. 3, productivity. They are now producing more with the same resources. And last, quality. Now functionality is higher, and they have improved the user experience of their internal clients. Again, single agenda, fewer projects, versatility, and separation between project and recurrent tasks. So now, with all of this, how does this apply to your reality, and how will you execute it yourself?
So we can do some really specific things with our structures to support behaviours like agility, but we know that organisation charts alone won't change behaviour. Corey, how do we make these words like agility become more than some aspirational statement that might just get overlooked when economic realities really come to the foreground?
Well, we all know that culture is much more than an aspirational statement. It's the way things get done. That's true whether it's in society or in organizations. It's our shared pattern of beliefs, it's the behaviors, and those things that turn strategy into execution and aspiration into action. And one of the rays of light in these unprecedented challenging times is how it's propelled equally unprecedented positive change. And we saw that highlighted a bit in the poll, a lot of evidence of positive change. So necessity has always been the mother of invention. And this crisis has delivered momentum towards new ways of working that are not just vital for surviving, but also for thriving. And momentum in culture change is, I think, one of the hardest things to build. And so the job to be done for CEOs and leaders is to maintain it, amplify it, and then to embed it into the fabric of the firm. So 3 actions from my perspective for leaders and teams to consider right now in building a better normal. The first is focused, the second is to lead by example, and the third is to amplify. So first up is focus. Wash your hands, social distance, shelter at home. The crisis has seen all of us, and indeed whole countries, change their behavior rapidly and decisively. And part of that comes from a laser focus on the few most meaningful behaviors that need to change. In order to maintain momentum and drive culture change, leadership teams need to choose few behaviors where they have absolute conviction that those behaviors are critical for both the immediate crisis and for accelerating through the turn. Perhaps we might each take a moment after this call to consider which breakthrough behaviors we've seen in our organizations during this crisis that we would wish to prioritize and focus on maintaining. And perhaps we can start there. Second is to lead by example. And the spotlight, not just on Zoom, but in general, has never been brighter for leaders. And the response to this crisis brings into absolute sharp relief whether or not leaders are living the culture and walking the talk as role models. One CEO recently shared with me that she's been running shorter daily board meetings to make real-time decisions. Sharing this changed approach across her organization sent a clear message of pace and cadence. As we move beyond this initial crisis response, leadership teams are now facing tough trade-offs. In particular, how do you continue to live the cultural values of togetherness and employee well-being when the response might be shifting to restructuring and redundancy. What we've seen working already is when leaders make the same sacrifices that they're asking of their organizations. And as the poll highlighted, empathy matters, and maintaining empathy, fairness, and humanity through these tough decisions builds both economic resilience as well as cultural strength. So the way leaders behave, how you make tough decisions, how you communicate them, will set a powerful tone from the top that will echo in your culture beyond the crisis. The third and final action then, amplify. And in order to avoid what Michelle called the reversion to the old ways of working, or the empire striking back, leaders need to champion the change that they are already seeing. Perhaps, like my family and I, you're also applauding our frontline health heroes. It's daily in New York and weekly in London, where clearly we're still a bit more culturally reserved. Similarly, leaders need to hero the team members and employees who are demonstrating the behaviors that matter, and amplify the stories of those that are living the values that will be vital to moving forward. And that's something that we can all do. Each of us can create that magic moment by creating and acknowledging the behaviors we see from our teams, our peers, even our bosses, that makes the biggest positive difference. So to recap, if we want the empathy, the collaboration, the agility we've seen emerge through this challenging time to endure beyond it, we need to focus, we need to lead by example, and we need to amplify the behaviors that best represent the culture that you want to create. If I have a hope, it's that we can use this adversity as an opportunity to build a better normal going forward. And with that in mind, back to you, Laura, to share how we hit the gas.
Thanks, Coy. I think just first a quick reflection that this is a really awful human and economic crisis. And I personally feel a massive sense of responsibility to do things that will help my organization, my clients' organization move their businesses forward, and to play my part in the community that I'm in. And I think as leaders, we all have the opportunity to really harness the transformation that's happening around us right now. And we can create lasting change in our organizations and drive greater success beyond the crisis. But if we do nothing, as some of you, my colleagues have alluded to already, things won't change or won't maintain. So hit the gas. Coy mentioned the theme of this webinar series is accelerating through the turn. So I guess this is a nod to that theme. And we recognize that we've brought up some pretty big topics here today. And so we wanted to wrap up with some more focused and specific actions that you can get started on right now. The first one is to get your leadership team aligned around a really focused set of business priorities. And as Michelle talked about early on, these should ideally be aligned to your overall purpose. Number two is, if you haven't got a baseline of your people, get started right now. And Paul said initially, it doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe just start with your key organizational capabilities. Number three is more related to the topic of organization design, and we heard both Michelle and Ignacio talk about this. And a sort of hit the gas action here would be, get the accountabilities for your most important goals documented and communicated and clear. And critical roles aren't necessarily just your most senior roles. And I'll give you an example. One organization that I've worked with sees its cadre of service mechanics as a really critical population. And the reason why is that group of people spends all of its time with customers, can have a huge impact on customer service. And service is the part of the business that organization wants to grow in the future. So what they've done is actually given each mechanic a budget that they can spend or use at their discretion to do additional maintenance that they feel would really serve their customers, beyond what's kind of stated in the contract. And to me, that's an example of true trust and empowerment. Number four is about really soaking up and listening and observing what's happening around you. What's working well? Why is it working well? Learn from that. Number 5 is about the symbolic actions of leaders that we heard Coy talking about earlier. And, you know, I think he mentioned pick the 1 or 2 behaviors that you would focus on. I would sort of raise the game a little bit here and say, you know, what can you do in the next 60 minutes after this webinar to demonstrate that you support certain key behaviors? One CEO that we've talked to has said, you know, this is a whole new world working virtually. I'm usually on a plane and I'm usually traveling 100% of my time, but it's so much more efficient and effective. And I'm going to commit to when travel restrictions come off, I'm going to travel no more than 50% of my time. And the final point here is something that I say to all of my clients when I'm helping them go through some sort of change in their organization. And it's go where the energy is. You may have your top 3 business priorities that you want to implement. But if you get a sense that number 3 on your list has the most organizational energy behind it, that your leaders will champion it, then go where the energy is and support that, because you're much more likely to get traction quickly. So we've reached the end of today's webinar and a few points to wrap up. I did mention earlier on that we would give you access to our organization scan. And at this stage, and you may remember this from the previous webinars, if you pick up your smartphone and if you open the camera and hold it up to the QR code here on screen, it will take you to a link to the website where you can do that scan right after this webinar. The second thing is we'd encourage you to sign up for the next 2 webinars, same time, Thursday and Friday, and I'll be back tomorrow with a different set of colleagues talking about how you can shape your future workforce. As we said earlier, the slides and the webinar recording, once it's downloaded, will also be emailed to you. And finally, I'd like to reiterate one thing to you. Go where the energy is. Your people know instinctively what the right thing to do is. Our role as leaders is to create the conditions that allow that to flourish. Thank you.